Okay, we're back again. Stasis theory, as we said, is a systematic way of asking questions about an issue, and it enables you to identify where you take your stand, where the issue lies, and where you need to take up your position and do battle with an opposing idea. And that's really what rhetoric is about. It is a form of battle. You're battling with a varying opinion or an idea, and you're trying to persuade of something. You want to win the argument, or at least give yourself the best chance of winning the argument. But also, before we go through this and apply it to a particular case, I also want to point out to you that stasis theory has more value than just enabling you to identify where the issue lies and where you need to take your stand. Here are some benefits of applying this systematic set of questions to an issue. First of all, it provides you with a helpful way of thinking through an issue thoroughly. Remember that the goal in rhetoric is copiousness. You want to be as thorough as you possibly can be. You cannot treat an issue thoroughly if you've not thought it through thoroughly. So stasis theory has that value of enabling you, really giving you a way of thinking the issue through as thoroughly as possible. Secondly, stasis theory supplies you with most of the information that you'll need for your narratio. The narratio, if you'll remember, is the third part of discourse. You have your introduction. Sorry, it's your second part of discourse. You have your introduction, your narratio, or the statement of facts. Then you have your division, then your proofs, both positive and negative, and then your conclusion. So the second part of discourse is the narratio, the statement of facts. That's where you give your background information. And probably the most important purpose of stasis theory is to give you the background on the issue. It will help you to think through what the background is, and then you can identify what part of the background you need for your case, to make your case. Now Sharon Crowley also identified, I think, about 4 different, let me look at my notes for a second here, 5 other benefits of stasis theory. She points out that stasis theory helps you to clarify your thinking about an issue in dispute. Also, she said, it forces you to think hard about the assumptions and values shared by yourself and members of your audience. What are the shared values between you all? Also, she said, it establishes areas in which more research needs to be done. As you go through this, you will see things where I need to study this a little bit more. I need to think it through a little bit more. So stasis theory helps you to identify where your research needs to focus. Also, it suggests which proofs are crucial to your case. And that's interesting because there are going to be, with all your arguments, all the arguments that you'll present in your piece of discourse, some will be more relevant, some less relevant, some will be strong, some will be weak. You need to know which ones are the strongest, which ones are the weakest, which ones are the most important to your case. Stasis theory helps you to identify those. And then finally, it helps you, or it can help you to see the most effective way to arrange your proofs as well. Again, because you're identifying your stronger arguments, your weaker arguments, your more necessary your arguments, and your arguments that are not as crucial, you can then from that decide where those arguments belong in your case and put them there. Sometimes arguments don't go with the proofs. Sometimes they go in the introduction. Sometimes they go in the statement of facts. but not stated directly as an argument, but rather an insinuation or the suggestion of an argument. Stasis theory will enable you to, or help you, it can help you to do those things. The only thing that you cannot do with stasis theory is to compose an entire piece of discourse from it. You cannot take stasis theory and say, this is what I'm going to say. You can come close to it, but you still need to arrange it. You still need to dress it up. If you think of it like you're making a cake, all right? Stasis theory gives you the flour and the sugar and the salt and the eggs and the milk, all right? And it lays it all out on the counter for you. But you still need to mix the eggs and the milk in with the flour and sugar and salt in order to make the cake batter and pour it in the cake pan and bake it. The baked cake is what you'll serve to your audience. So stasis theory helps you to collect all of the ingredients and then decide where those ingredients go and how they need to. Nobody wants a cake with the eggs on top. You just don't want to see the eggs in it. You want eggs to be in the cake mix, but you don't want to recognize the egg in the cake mix. And that's where, if you take stasis theory the wrong way, everyone's going to see your eggs, and you don't want that. All right, so let's go back through the steps again, and this time we're asking this question. Should one marry? Should one marry? That's our question. And we start out deciding whether the question is formulated as a thesis or a hypothesis. Remember the difference? A thesis is a general issue. All right? A hypothesis would ask that question about something specific. A hypothesis: should Luke marry? Should cousins marry? Should 60-year-olds marry? Should divorced people marry? And so on. It is more specific, so it's considering a specific thing. In this case, should one marry as a thesis? It's a general issue. Having decided that, step 2 applies. It would not apply if we were looking at it as a hypothesis, all right? But because it's a thesis, we're asking, should we state it theoretically or practically? Is this a theoretical question, or is it a practical question? Is it a question of knowledge, or is it a question of action? In this case, I think the answer should be pretty clear to you. We would ask, should one marry as a practical question? It's a question of doing. It's a deed to be done. All right? Then we come to the meat of stasis theory. The first thing we need to identify before we go through all the questions of stasis, we need to decide which of these 4 questions is most relevant to our issue. We're asking, should one marry? Is it a question of conjecture? Are we asking whether marriage exists or not? Well, no, not really. We're not asking that. Is it a question of definition? We're asking what it is. What kind of thing is it? And so on. Is it a question of quality? Is it good or bad? Is it right or wrong? Or is it a question of procedure? What should we do about it? How should we regulate it? And so on. At first glance, I think the question, should one marry, might seem to be a question of procedure. The one thing I want to stress to you is that there isn't a right and wrong answer on these things. You are the one, you're in the driver's seat. When you work through this, you're working through it yourself. Now, as you work through it, you want your answers to be helpful to your case. And that means that they need to be plausible answers. So as you ask the question, understand you have liberty. You can say, oh, This question, should one marry, it is a question of conjecture. We're asking whether it exists. And then you can get up and in answer to that question, you can make your entire discourse about the existence of marriage itself, okay? The problem is, of course, that your audience is not going to be convinced that people actually should marry because you prove to them that marriage exists. So that's why you need to be careful to think it through and come up with plausible answers. Okay? So, again, at first glance, it may seem to be a question of procedure. What should we do? What course of action should we take? But I would argue that, as we already have discussed, that it's more a question of quality. We do need to know whether marriage exists and how we know that it exists. We need to answer what marriage is. We need to know that to make our case. But the question, whether one should, this word should here is a moral question. The moral ought right there. And so that clearly identifies it as a question of quality. Is marriage a good thing or a bad thing? Do we approve of it or disapprove of it? Is it right or wrong? In most discussions about the benefit of marriage, it seems to me that the question boils down to more a question of quality than procedure. So we'll mark it as a question of quality. Now, let's throw this out to you also, sticking with the battle metaphor. Because stasis is identifying where the issue lies, where is the main point of battle? In all battles, you don't want every gun trained on one spot on the battlefield. Even though, for instance, you're trying to flank your opponent and defeat him on the left, the only way that you can defeat him on the left flank is if you have your guns trained in other parts of the battlefield as well. You've got to engage the enemy at other points, or else you can't sweep them off the battlefield from the left flank. I figure the guys will appreciate these battle metaphors maybe a little more than the girls, but nonetheless, if we think of a rhetorical situation as a battlefront, then the reason we need to answer all these questions of stasis is because we do have to engage the enemy at every point. We have to engage them at this point right here. We can't really argue that one should marry if we can't even demonstrate that marriage exists, that there is such a thing as marriage. The world, for instance, says that marriage is simply a human construct, something that we've put together. It doesn't really mean anything today, which is why they then insist that gays and lesbians should have the right to marry, because, you know, it's not really anything anyway. It just gives us tax advantages, and they should have those same tax advantages. So you've got to be able to argue for its existence, but also argue, you've got to engage the enemy on the question of definition, of what marriage is specifically. So it's rare for the issue to lie exclusively in one of these 4 points. That's important to understand. That's why you need to answer each specific question. All right, we're ready to start step 4. I'm going to turn this around and we'll come back to it. We come to the 4th step, which is examining each of these specific questions and the issue in light of each of these questions. So as I said, we need to be prepared to engage the enemy at every point. So we have to think these all these points through. And then when we've thought them through, we want to answer each question. So stasis theory is a tool. And, you know, just like with anything else, you're using a screwdriver to pull the screw out, and then at some point, it becomes a pain in the neck to use a screwdriver, and you just unscrew the rest of it with your fingers. And the same thing here. If it's helpful, answer the question. If it's not helpful or you don't think it's relevant, you don't have to answer the question. All right? You're not required to every time, except in the case of an assignment when you've got to have an answer for everyone. If you're given a stasis theory assignment, which you may be, then you would need to attempt an answer at everything. Okay? But let me add to that though you don't have to answer every question, because it's your tool. You use it or not use it according to what you want. You should try, though. I find that when I'm using stasis theory, I find that the questions that I think, that's not really relevant, I don't need to answer that. But then later, as I think about it, I think, yeah, you know what? I missed something important because I didn't answer that question. And then I go back and answer it. But that also shows you the value of this approach to thinking an issue through, because it makes you think about all these things, and it trains your mind how to approach any given issue. That being said, let's start at conjecture. The question of conjecture is asking about the existence. Is this real or not? Does it exist? How widespread is its use? Is it confined to a few small groups of people, or does it permeate the general community, the general culture? That's this first question right here. When we answer that in terms of marriage, I would imagine that most Christians especially are already thinking through that. Can you pause that in a second? I would think that most Christians would already be able to answer this question, marriage exists. And we know this not in a naturalistic, this is what we see happening around us. It doesn't exist because men made it, because men didn't make it. God made marriage. We see that in the beginning. And of course, that's part of the next question. How did it begin? So we can limit our answer on this one just to say that marriage exists because God made it. What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So God is the one who made marriage. And that takes us to the next question. How did it begin? We can again say God made it, and we know that He made it in the Garden of Eden when He made Eve and brought her to Adam, and Adam took her as his wife. But Adam didn't just take her as his wife, just say, I'll make you my wife, like he made up that word. Because the Bible teaches us that God joined them together. We learn really all that we need to know about marriage by observing the first marriage between Adam and Eve. So marriage is not man's institution. It is God's. It's not a human construct. It is God's institution of the family. What causes it? Well, we have already kind of answered that question in our discussion right now. The Bible consistently points to the fact that God joins man and woman together as husband and wife. So men do not cause marriage, God does. And that's something, probably a minor point, but I've performed a dozen or so weddings at this point. I've never married two people together. I married my wife, but when I perform a wedding, I am not making them man and wife. I'm facilitating the marriage. I am giving them their vows and overseeing the exchange of vows between them. But I am not marrying them. God marries them. What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So I don't have any authority to pronounce them man and wife. Again, it's a minor point, I'm sure. Not one I would quibble with a lot of people over. But I don't say, by the authority vested in me, blah, 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 I now pronounce you man and wife. I don't. because I'm not making them man and wife. I rather present the bride and groom as man and wife to the audience. But that's a part of thinking this through. What causes it? God causes it. All right? And then thirdly, can it be changed? Now, we're not asking whether an individual marriage can be changed. Again, remember, our question is, should one marry? That's our question. It's a thesis. It's a general question. So we're not asking whether an individual specific marriage, the marriage between Tom and Betty, can be changed. We're asking about the institution itself. Can the institution of marriage be changed? Now see, that's where the world says, oh yeah. It goes along, if I can sidetrack for a second, take a rabbit trail. It goes along with the way the world views life itself. We're evolutionists today. Our society, our culture is predominantly naturalistic. Even among Christians, most Christians believe that the world evolved. And evolution would teach that everything is permanently malleable. We're in a constant state of flux. The only constant is flux. And so, to them, we can make new kinds of creatures. They're being made all the time. So, a man born with a woman's body, which we would call a girl, but later on discovers, I've got this girl body, but I'm a man inside. And we're making a third sex, and we'll come up with 4 or 5 more, probably. And the same thing when it comes to the institution of marriage. We think that it can be changed. But marriage is not a human institution. It's a divine institution. If our Supreme Court rules that 2 sisters can marry, or that a man can marry his 4-wheeler, that won't change the institution of marriage that God created. So no, marriage cannot be changed. Okay, on to the question of definition. How can the act be defined? All right, now your definition is really important. Whether the issue lies here or not, it's important how you define the term. Your definition must allow you to take your position on defensible ground. So it is important that you define the issue in a way that you can defend. All right? So we start with this question. What kind of thing is it? Well, if we're looking really at the broad category that it belongs to, which we're going to look at the larger class of things, and that's more specifically the genus. But we get even broader right here. So this is a genus, and this is the genus of that genus. Okay, so a man is a person, and a person is a being, and other beings would be angels and deity, because God is a being as well. So that's what I mean. There are layers of genus and species here. So we're going beyond to see the broadest kind of thing that it is. You know, your answer on this, you may come up with a better answer than I have, but I want to give you an answer to demonstrate how this works. Marriage is a kind of social relationship, and therefore it is part of society at large. All right? To what larger class of things does it belong? Okay? Again, I'm trying to think through it, and you have to think hard about this. One thing, by the way, that is helpful on definition is if you get a dictionary out and just take a look at how the dictionary defines, because usually it will help you to identify the class and the larger category and so on, the genuses. Marriage belongs to the larger class of institutions established by God. Remember that there are 3 institutions in society that God established. the family, the church, and the civil government. So marriage is one of those three institutions. What distinguishes it from other members of its class? Marriage is distinguished from civil government and, what were those institutions again? The church. Thanks, I had to look at my notes. Okay, so you have the family, the church, and the civil government. So marriage is distinguished from those others because it is the God-ordained institution that unites one man to one woman for life in a family unit. All right, let's pause it there.
35.
35?
Yep.